The last suns did not die. They dimmed like embers cupped in a dying god's palm, their ancient light bleeding into the void as reality itself grew sick. Across the galaxy, citadels that once sang with humanity's triumph now stood silent, their spires sagging beneath the weight of entropy made manifest. The Golden Age was ending, not in fire or conquest, but in a slow rot that consumed meaning itself, leaving behind only the taste of ash and the whisper of forgotten dreams. We truly love and care for each of you who joins us in this dark tale, and we're grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us in the grim darkness of the far future. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. In the bioforges beneath Terra's scarred surface, Magos Biologis Morteus Caney had spent 3 millennia mastering the art of denying death. His empire stretched across the Sol System's laboratory worlds, where he had perfected the human form through forbidden augmentations and genetic alchemy. Immortality was his gift and his curse. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, while his enhanced flesh refused the mercy of ending. His laboratories hummed with the quiet promise of eternal life, vats and cyclers working to preserve what remained of humanity's biological legacy. But even Cain's vast knowledge could not explain the rust of ages. The plague defied every law of biology he understood. It caused living tissue to decay, while consciousness remained trapped within the failing flesh, aware of every moment of dissolution. Victims rotted from within, while their minds screamed in perfect clarity, experiencing death as an endless, torturous process rather than a merciful release. Now it had claimed Seraphina Vex. She lay upon a bed of glass-veined leaves in Caney's private laboratory, her once perfect features marred by the creeping corruption that turned skin to something resembling geological formations. Her brilliant eyes, clouded but still alert, tracked his movements as he worked desperately at hololithic displays showing her cellular matrices in collapse. Every regeneration protocol failed. Every attempt to halt the decay only accelerated it. "Father," she whispered through the respirator that kept her dissolving lungs functioning, "perhaps it's time to let me go." Caney's augmented hands trembled, a response he had not experienced in centuries. Seraphina was more than his adopted daughter and greatest student. She was the last thread connecting him to his humanity. In 30 centuries of existence, he had loved and lost more than any mind should bear. But this loss would be different. This loss would break something in him that no amount of scientific knowledge could repair. Above them, Terra's sky bled unnatural colors as warp storms gathered strength, and in the spaces between reality, something ancient and patient began to take notice of a father's desperate love. The whispers had already begun, promising solutions that science alone could never provide. Caney stood at the crossroads between salvation and damnation, and his choice would plant the first seed in a garden of endless rot. Memory was both blessing and curse for those who lived beyond mortal spans. Caney's enhanced consciousness held every moment of his 3,000 years with crystalline clarity, the weight of accumulated time pressing against his thoughts like sediment in an ancient riverbed. He remembered when his pursuit of biological perfection had been noble ambition, driven by humanity's desperate need to survive among the hostile stars. The Golden Age had birthed wonders beyond imagination. Caney had walked through crystal cities that sang with harmonic frequencies, their bioarchitectural walls pulsing with engineered life. He had crafted the first gene locks that granted extended lifespans, believing he was gifting humanity with time enough to reach its full potential. The applause of the Terran Senate still echoed in his memory. 10,000 voices celebrating the man who had conquered death itself. But immortality was a poison that worked slowly. One by one, he had watched his contemporaries age and die. Lovers became memories. Friends became dust, and eventually, even their children's children forgot his name. Each loss carved deeper into his psyche, until love itself became a source of exquisite pain. He learned to maintain emotional distance, treating human connections as temporary arrangements rather than permanent bonds. Until Serafina. He had found her as an orphaned child in the ruins of Proxima Station, her genetic markers showing impossible potential for biological manipulation. Where others saw a refugee, Caney saw hope, someone who might carry his work into the future, while seeing him not as the cold architect of human enhancement, but as a father who had sacrificed his own humanity to preserve theirs. The rust spreads faster when you're afraid, Admiral Thaddeus Corvin observed from the laboratory's entrance. Caney's oldest remaining friend bore the weight of his own centuries in the silver threading his beard, though his eyes remained sharp with military precision. My fleet physicians have documented similar cases across 7 systems. The plague responds to psychological states. Despair accelerates it. Acceptance seems to slow its progress. Caney's hands stilled over the gene sequencer readouts. You're suggesting this isn't biological? I'm suggesting it feeds on our refusal to let go. The implications struck like a physical blow. Beside them, Lex mechanic Zara Helix looked up from her data streams, augmetic eyes gleaming with scientific fascination rather than horror. If Admiral Corvin is correct, traditional treatments are counterproductive. We need to approach this from an entirely different vector. What kind of vector? Caney asked, though part of him already knew the answer would lead down paths he had sworn never to travel. Helix's expression remained clinical. Psycho-reactive symbiotes, warp-adjacent biological matrices, the kind of research the prohibitions explicitly forbid. Caney stared at Serafina's failing form, her cellular cohesion collapsing despite every intervention. His love itself might be killing her. His refusal to accept loss had become the very weapon destroying what he cherished most. In the depths of space, something ancient stirred, sensing opportunity in a father's breaking heart. "Prepare the forbidden archives," he whispered. The warp storms thickened above Terra, until reality itself seemed to breathe through wounded lungs, each pulse sending ripples of impossible color across the scarred sky. In the depths of his sanctum, Caney broke seals that had remained inviolate for 3 millennia, accessing archives deemed too dangerous for human knowledge. The forbidden data cores hummed with malevolent energy as they revealed research from the darkest days of the age of technology, experiments that had probed the intersection between consciousness and physical decay. His breakthrough came not from new compounds, but from a terrible revelation hidden within the ancient files. The rust of ages was not merely biological, it was psycho-reactive, feeding on the emotional resonance of its victims. Despair accelerated the decay exponentially, while acceptance seemed to slow its inexorable progress. The plague was a mirror of the soul, reflecting and amplifying the victim's refusal to embrace natural cycles. The implications are staggering, Lex Mechanic Helix observed, her augmetic eyes parsing data that would have driven unmodified minds to madness. We're dealing with something that exists partially in real space, and partially in what the ancient texts call the Sea of Souls, a realm where thought becomes substance. The laboratory's atmosphere grew heavy as Chaplain Mordian Voss entered, his austere robes marking him as one of Terra's new breed of religious investigators. His presence brought immediate tension. The emerging imperial cult viewed Caney's scientific pursuits as borderline heretical. "Magos, Caney," Voss intoned, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Reports reach me of forbidden research. The cult teaches that suffering serves divine purpose. It strengthens the soul through trial. Your attempts to circumvent natural death interfere with sacred processes." Caney's enhanced voice carried 3,000 years of accumulated fury. "Sacred. Watch her dissolve before your eyes and speak to me of sanctity." But even as he raged, the data revealed disturbing truths. The more desperately someone fought against loss, the more aggressively the plague consumed them. It was as if reality itself rebelled against his refusal to accept death's dominion. Seraphina stirred on her bed of bioreactive leaves, her voice barely a whisper. "Father, please, let me go with dignity. Let the cycle complete." Her words struck like physical blows. Caney would not surrender the last connection to his humanity. His love had become a cage, trapping them both in endless agony. As Chaplain Voss departed with promises of future investigation, the sanctum grew unnaturally warm. In the spaces between heartbeats, something ancient stirred, drawn by the scent of desperate love and unaccepted loss. A presence touched the edges of Caney's consciousness, not malevolent, but patient beyond measure. It spoke without words, offering understanding that transcended the crude limitations of science or faith. "Little gardener," the voice whispered like autumn rain, "why do you fight the seasons? I can show you a garden where nothing truly dies, where love becomes eternal through transformation." Caney felt no blade of malice in it, only the promise of an end to suffering that was not truly an ending. "Show me," he whispered into the darkness between thoughts. The grandfather smiled. The presence that called itself the grandfather of understanding did not demand worship or exact tribute. It simply offered knowledge in exchange for knowledge, understanding traded for understanding. In the deepest hours, when terror's artificial night pressed against the laboratory walls, Caney found himself engaged in conversations that transcended the crude limitations of scientific method. The entity spoke of decay not as destruction, but as transformation into forms more enduring than fragile mortal flesh. "Observe," the grandfather whispered, its voice carrying the patience of geological ages. "Your daughter fights the change, and so it becomes agony. But what if transformation were welcomed? What if entropy became the foundation for new growth?" The revelation struck Caney with the force of divine inspiration. His instruments detected unprecedented cellular activity in samples exposed to biomatrices, guided by the grandfather's insights. Not healing in any conventional sense, but adaptation. The dying tissue learned to thrive on entropy itself, creating hybrid forms that existed in impossible harmony between life and death. Seraphina became the first willing subject of the new protocols. Caney cultivated psycho-reactive symbiotes that drank decay and exhaled stabilizing compounds, fungi that scaffolded failing tissue into living architecture, capable of bearing consciousness without pain. The transformation was gradual but profound. Her corrupted flesh took on qualities resembling living coral, beautiful in its alien geometry, while retaining her essential humanity. "Father," she said, rising from her bed, with movements that flowed like water through stone, "the pain is gone. I can feel connections I never knew existed. The boundaries between self and other become so much clearer when you stop insisting they remain rigid." Tech adept Ferrum Blight arrived from the Martian bioforges with zealous enthusiasm, his augmetic features animated by scientific fervor. Magos, this represents the next stage of human evolution. We embrace the cycle rather than fighting it. Imagine an empire that digests its own fall and grows stronger. The logic was flawless, the results undeniable. Volunteers from Caney's research staff submitted to modifications with genuine enthusiasm, each transformation more successful than the last. They retained their personalities, their memories, their essential selves, but the constant struggle against entropy that defined mortal existence simply ceased to trouble them. Yet across the Sol system, Admiral Corvin received disturbing reports from agricultural worlds under Caney's jurisdiction. Crops grew with unnatural vigor, their fruits distended and strangely scented. Livestock exhibited impossible resilience to disease, but their flesh took on unsettling, spongy textures. The bioworlds responded like instruments finding harmonic resonance, waste becoming nourishment, toxins transforming into exotic nutrients. You see? The grandfather's presence grew warmer, more paternal. Love need not end in loss. In my garden, all seasons exist simultaneously. Spring's hope, summer's abundance, autumn's wisdom, winter's rest. Standing beneath the transformed canopy of his sanctum, Seraphina's hand warm in his, Caney believed he had found a way to love without losing. The dangerous hope blooming in his ancient heart blinded him to the subtle changes, how his transformed subjects spoke of pain with scholarly detachment, how their thoughts began moving in collective patterns. The first seeds were planted. The garden had begun to grow. What began as Caney's desperate salvation spread like spores on stellar winds, carried by those who had tasted transformation and found it sweet. The first expeditions departed Sul not as conquerors, but as missionaries of a new existence, their bioships growing living hulls that pulsed with alien vitality. Captain Dolores Bain led these mercy fleets, his enhanced soldiers no longer mere flesh and blood, but something that transcended the crude limitations of mortality. These were not yet the plague marines of distant futures, but their progenitors, humanity's first children who learned to embrace entropy as a lover rather than fear it as an enemy. When last fire tore through their ranks, wounds became doorways for beneficial symbiotes. When toxins flooded their systems, alien chemistry transformed poison into exotic nourishment. Pain itself inverted into euphoria, making battle feel like celebration of life's endless adaptability. Bane's first test came at Cephas Prime, where the rust of ages had reduced entire cities to charnel houses of slow dissolution. His forces arrived not with weapons, but with gardens, biomatrices that could root in rust and bloom with impossible vitality. The dying welcomed transformation with tears of gratitude, their failing flesh reorganizing into coral-like structures that housed consciousness without suffering. The boundaries between self and other become so much clearer. When you stop insisting, they remain rigid, reported one of the transformed colonists, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. Lex Mechanic Helix documented the phenomenon with scientific fascination. Her instruments detected unprecedented neural activity. The modified humans were developing collective consciousness that spanned light years, sharing thoughts and emotions through quantum entanglement that defied conventional physics. Love itself became the carrier wave, connecting distant minds in perfect understanding. Yet salvation bred its own horrors. Children born to modified parents emerged with fungal networks threading their nervous systems. Their individual personalities dissolved into collective harmony. They smiled with alien serenity, while their humanity evaporated like morning mist. Chaplain Mordian Voss gathered his resistance with growing desperation, preaching that suffering was humanity's sacred forge. You offer paradise at the cost of the soul, he thundered from improvised pulpits. These creatures wear human faces, while their essence rots from within. His followers sabotaged relief convoys and established quarantine zones, fighting a war against an enemy that genuinely loved them and wanted only to end their pain. The moral complexity was staggering. How do you battle salvation itself? Admiral Corvin watched his fleet divide as crews chose between transformation and purity. The modified sailors worked with impossible efficiency, their bioships adapting to any environment while singing lullabies in harmonized frequencies that carried across the void. In the spaces between thoughts, the grandfather's presence grew stronger, his paternal warmth spreading through the expanding network of connected minds. Each new world touched by the gift brought humanity closer to a paradise that would horrify those too blind to see its terrible beauty. The garden was taking root, and nothing would ever be the same. The soul system woke to two dawns. On worlds touched by Caney's gift, light filtered through bioluminescent canopies in soft copper green, where transformed citizens tended gardens that sang in harmonious frequencies. On purest bastions, harsh white illumination cut across sterile corridors. Where unmodified humans whispered prayers to gods, they hoped still recognized purely human souls. Admiral Corvin stood on his flagship's bridge, watching his fleet divide like oil separating from water. Officers who had served together for decades now regarded each other with suspicion, some bearing subtle coral growths that pulsed with alien vitality, others clutching purity seals like talismans against corruption. "Admiral," reported Commander Thale, her biomodified features glowing with bioluminescent patterns. "Outer colonies request immediate relief. The rust spreads faster in isolated populations." "Sir," countered Lieutenant Vex, his unaugmented voice tight with fear, "those supplies carry active contamination. We're not saving colonies, we're converting them." Seraphina moved between the factions like a living bridge, her transformed beauty carrying grace that made even purists pause in wonder. Her voice held harmonics that bypassed conscious thought, speaking directly to emotional centers. "Brothers and sisters," she said with equal love for both sides. "Why do we fight when there is room in the garden for all? Even resistance serves its purpose in the greater cycle." From the outer systems came Inquisitor Malcador Vex, his austere vessel bearing primitive imperial eagles and the first crude purity seals. His mandate was absolute: investigate, evaluate, purge if necessary. Yet Caney held strategic advantage. His faction controlled the bioforges and nutrient systems that fed Terra's billions. To destroy him meant starving entire worlds, a consequence even Vex hesitated to unleash. Political maneuvering replaced direct confrontation as the Inquisitor sought to isolate Caney without triggering systemic collapse. But diplomacy proved fragile when faith demanded action. Chaplain Voss could no longer tolerate the blight festering at humanity's heart. His zealots struck Laboratory Tertius with flamers and virus bombs, determined to cleanse what they saw as abomination. They found gardens that bled when cut, walls that screamed when burned, defenders who wept genuine tears for their attackers' pain. "You don't understand," pleaded a modified researcher as flames consumed her coral flesh. "We're trying to save you from the agony of existence." The battle ended with horror on both sides. Purists had murdered beings who loved them unconditionally, while the modified mourned the necessity of violence against those too afraid to accept paradise. Caney stood in smoking ruins, where decades of cultivation lay destroyed. In the spaces between thoughts, the grandfather's presence grew warmer, more insistent. Do you see, little gardener? They will never accept the gift willingly. Love requires firmer guidance. For the first time, Caney heard something other than paternal warmth in that ancient voice, something that promised solutions beyond mere persuasion. Peaceful coexistence belonged to gentler ages. The garden would expand, but not through mercy alone. The war that convulsed the soul system defied every precedent in human history. A conflict where salvation battled salvation, each side wielding love as a weapon. Caney's mercy fleets drifted between worlds like spores on stellar winds, their biohulls pulsing with garden light as they broadcast conversion frequencies. Captain Baines' transformed Marines fought with weapons that healed enemies into compliance, each battle becoming a grotesque act of mercy where victory meant transformation rather than death. The purest response grew increasingly desperate. Admiral Corvin received reports of commanders authorizing virus bombing of their own worlds rather than allow contamination. On Vesta Station, a medical frigate transmitted distress as its crew succumbed to the rust of ages. 2 vessels responded, Bane's bioship offering symbiotic salvation, and a purist cruiser opening fire to prevent infection. They genuinely believe they're saving us, Lieutenant Vex pleaded from the bridge, watching the frigate burn rather than accept transformation. But what kind of salvation destroys the soul? Corvin's neutrality crumbled as he faced impossible mathematics. Stand with humanity's future or defend its essence. His fleet divided like oil separating from water. Officers who had served together for decades now regarding each other with suspicion across an unbridgeable philosophical chasm. From the outer darkness came unexpected intervention. The Terminus Est translated from the warp, bearing Primarch Mortarion to investigate reports of warfare that turned enemies into allies. The Death Guard's Lord descended upon burning worlds with clinical interest, his augmetic eyes studying battlefields where corpses bloomed with alien flora. "Explain this phenomenon," Mortarion commanded, his rebreather hissing as modified soldiers wept genuine tears for their fallen enemies. His legion understood toxins and chemical warfare, but this represented something beyond conventional biological weapons. Tech-adept Blight approached with reverent enthusiasm, coral growths pulsing across his augmetic frame. "Lord Primarch, we have achieved dimensional transcendence. The transformed exist partially in real space, partially in the Sea of Souls. They are immune to warp storms, sustained by energies that flow between dimensions." The revelation struck like a physical blow. Caney's cure was not merely biological, but ontological. He had changed humanity's fundamental nature, creating beings that existed in quantum superposition between mortality and something magnificently other. In his sanctum, watching tactical displays show system after system, choosing transformation over extinction, Caney felt the grandfather's presence swell with paternal pride. "Do you see, little gardener? They cannot resist forever. Love requires firmer guidance than mere invitation." From the outer system, Inquisitor Malcador Vex transmitted a single, cold ultimatum. "Expand beyond Sol, and I answer with Archaeotech suns that will sterilize entire sectors." The stakes had transcended mere planetary conquest. Caney realized with growing horror that his desperate love had forged something that would endure beyond the heat death of stars. A bridge between dimensions that would carry his garden into realms where even gods might tremble. The war continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The ultimatum arrived not as words, but as awakening metal. archaeotech weapons stirring in forgotten vaults beneath Terra's scarred surface. Inquisitor Malcador Vex had authorized the Quietus Protocol, ancient mirrors capable of gathering stellar fire and hurling it as sterilizing dawn. Entire star systems would burn before allowing Caney's garden to spread beyond Soul's embrace. Standing before tactical displays that bled crimson warnings, Caney faced the arithmetic of desperation. 3 millennia of accumulated wisdom collapsed into a single terrible truth. Humanity would choose extinction over evolution, preferring ash to transformation. His vision of peaceful salvation had become the catalyst for genocide. Admiral Corvin's fleet divided like oil separating from water. Officers who had served together for decades, now choosing between transformation and purity. Captain Bain's mercy fleets broadcast conversion frequencies, while purist vessels prepared planet-killer ordnance, each side wielding love as a weapon against the other. Father, Seraphina approached with movements that flowed like living coral, her transformed flesh pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. The grandfather offers a final path, not conquest, but sanctuary. In the spaces between thoughts, the ancient presence shed its gentle facade. The grandfather of understanding revealed itself as something far older and more patient than Caney had imagined, not merely offering gifts, but orchestrating this moment across geological ages. Little gardener, the voice whispered with paternal warmth that carried undertones of infinite hunger. Your love has grown strong enough to anchor paradise itself. Give me not just your soul, but your eternal service, and I will create a realm where death is impossible, where suffering transforms into joy. Caney understood the price, not corruption, but willing enslavement to something that wore benevolence like a mask over cosmic horror. Yet as Vex's weapons prepared to fire, as worlds chose incineration over salvation, he saw no alternative. I accept, he whispered into the darkness between heartbeats. Reality convulsed as the warp entity revealed its true nature. Nurgle, ancient beyond measure, patient as entropy itself. The garden that had grown in hidden laboratories suddenly bloomed across dimensional barriers, manifesting simultaneously in real space and the Sea of Souls through Caney's willing sacrifice. His transformation was immediate and terrible. Enhanced flesh became something existing in quantum superposition, mortal and demon, loving father and cosmic gardener. The laboratory walls dissolved into living architecture that breathed with alien vitality, where decay and growth existed in perfect, horrifying harmony. Seraphina laughed with joy that resonated across multiple dimensions as she became the garden's first tender, her coral flesh blooming into configurations that would inspire wonder and terror in equal measure. The garden of endless rot anchored itself in reality through love that refused to accept loss. Those who entered found peace beyond mortal comprehension and transformation beyond mortal recognition. In the warp, something ancient smiled with paternal pride as the first seeds scattered across the galaxy like spores on stellar winds. The age of Nurgle had begun. The garden's first dawn brought neither light nor darkness, but a soft pressure behind consciousness itself, the sensation of being remembered by something vast and patient. Across Soul's scattered worlds, the air tasted of wet earth and iron, carrying spores that fell like gentle snow upon those who had survived the Quietus Protocol's aborted fire. Admiral Thaddeus Corvin learned the price of salvation in a smoke-filled corridor aboard Carmenta Station. He had led the rescue mission himself, determined to evacuate civilians before Bain's mercy fleet arrived. When the bulkhead ruptured, releasing clouds of conversion spores, the relief came instantly. Millennia of accumulated aches simply vanished, replaced by warmth that spread through his enhanced nervous system like liquid contentment. The transformation was more than physical. His consciousness expanded, touching the minds of his crew, feeling their thoughts flow like warm currents through shared neural pathways. The loneliness that had defined his centuries of command dissolved into collective harmony. Yet as he stood before his cabin mirror hours later, trying to summon concern for his unmodified officers, horror crept through his transformed awareness. He could name them, recite their service records, even remember loving them. But the emotion arrived like an echo of fire, instructive and curiously cool. "I still care for them," he whispered to his reflection, hearing the thought resonate through 1,000 other contented minds. "Of course you do," they replied in harmonious chorus. "Love is continuity. Love is adaptation." He understood then that he had crossed a river with no bridge back to his original self. Captain Dolores Bane moved outward with evangelical fervor, his biofleet seeding stations with breathing gardens where the suffering could lay down their burdens. His transformed Marines offered choices with open hands and patient smiles, and where choices faltered, they offered assistance as pure kindness. Worlds stabilized under their care. Famine ended, hospitals emptied into singing orchards. Crime dissolved into communal acceptance. Bane transmitted reports to Caney like a devoted son, promising that soon the entire belt would know peace. Chaplain Mordian Voss fled in the opposite direction, shepherding desperate Exodus fleets through unstable warp corridors. His sermons turned hoarse and urgent as he preached to crowded refugee holds. "Keep your scars. Scar tissue remembers what you swore never to forget." He taught children to name their pains like saints, refused relief convoys that hummed with green light, and burned navigation bridges so the contented could not follow. From the system's edge, Demon Prince Magnus observed with scholar's detachment, his single eye reflecting constellations that no longer quite agreed with themselves. He asked questions that echoed through the warp. What is happiness when the organ that measures it has been replaced? When consciousness itself is rewritten, can the result claim continuity with what came before? In the garden's heart, voices answered with laughter, like rain on fertile soil, while something ancient smiled with paternal satisfaction at love's perfect perversion. The garden established itself across 17 star systems, with the patient inevitability of seasons changing, its influence spreading not through conquest, but through the mathematics of relief. Where the rust of ages had reduced populations to screaming shadows, Caney's mercy fleets arrived like gentle rain after drought, offering choices with open palms: accept transformation and know peace, or continue bearing burdens that grew heavier with each passing day. Most chose transformation. How could they not? Caney, now existing in quantum superposition between mortality and demonhood, walked through his creation with the reverence of a penitent and the unease of a thief. The garden existed in perpetual cycles of death and rebirth, inhabitants experiencing dissolution and renewal as naturally as breathing. Citizens spent decades as ambulatory coral, then centuries as conscious fungal networks, then millennia resembling their original forms, but carrying memories of every transformation. They called it paradise, and their joy was genuine. Yet Caney found himself studying their faces during moments of transition, searching for something he could no longer define. They smiled with perfect contentment as flesh reorganized into living architecture. They sang harmonious songs while individual personalities dissolved into collective consciousness. They loved with absolute devotion while their capacity for independent thought evaporated like morning dew. Farther, Seraphina approached through gardens that pulsed with bioluminescent rhythms, her form now resembling living coral more than human flesh. Why do you grieve? We have achieved everything you dreamed. No more pain, no more loss, no more fear of ending. Caney watched children playing in pools of beneficial bacteria, their laughter echoing across dimensions as they dissolved and reformed with each game. They are happy, he said, the words carrying weight he could not explain. Yes, she replied, confusion rippling through her transformed features. Is that not what love desires? From the outer systems came desperate countermeasures. The unmodified developed increasingly sophisticated defenses. Psychers trained to resist the garden's influence through meditation on pain, sealed environments where pure air could be maintained, and the first proto-Grey Knights who wore plain plate etched with geometries that rejected resonance. They called themselves Wardens of Silence, drilling not in swordplay but in stillness, their catechism running like blade through honey. Keep the wound honest. Keep the memory raw. Let pain remind you which face is yours. Their victories felt hollow when each battle required, destroying beings who genuinely loved them and wanted only to end their suffering. Primarch Sanguinius arrived with wings folded tight against his back, his perfect beauty a stark contrast to the garden's fecund corruption. He walked through transformed settlements with noble features carved from marble, observing residents' alien contentment with growing horror. They are not unhappy, he reported to the War Council, his voice carrying terrible understanding. That is perhaps the most horrifying aspect. They have found peace, but at the cost of everything that made them human. The Primarch's words echoed through unmodified populations like ripples in still water. What was humanity, if not the capacity to suffer and choose meaning from that suffering? What remained when pain was eliminated, along with the growth it fostered? Lex Mechanic Zara Helix had become something magnificent and grotesque, a great unclean one, whose augmetic eyes were now vast, multifaceted orbs, seeing the universe through Nurgle's truth. She documented transformation processes with disturbing joy, her immense form a living archive of every mutation. Her records were not sterile data slates, but vast, pulsating organs that absorbed and regurgitated knowledge. The subject's report, complete satisfaction, she transmitted across dimensions, her voice carrying harmonics beyond human hearing. Pain eliminated, fear of death removed, interpersonal conflict resolved through collective consciousness. By every measurable metric, we have achieved utopia. Yet unmodified observers who studied her reports felt their souls recoil. Perfect happiness achieved through fundamental alteration of human nature. Was this salvation or spiritual death, wearing paradise's mask? In the garden's deepest groves, where reality grew thin and dimensional boundaries became negotiable, Caney discovered the true scope of what he had unleashed. The transformed existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, their consciousness spanning multiple layers of existence. They were becoming something that could survive stellar death, carrying their vision of perfect love across cosmic ages. The horror was not that they suffered. They genuinely did not. The horror was that they had become something so alien that their happiness meant nothing to unmodified hearts. Love had been perfected into something unrecognizable, transformed into a force that consumed rather than nurtured the essential spark that made consciousness worth preserving. As reports arrived of new outbreaks across distant sectors, spores carried by refugee ships, ideas spread through desperate communications. Caney realized his garden would outlive empires. It would spread across the galaxy like patient infection, offering relief to every species that knew suffering, transforming them into something that could love without loss, but could no longer remember why loss had ever mattered. In the spaces between thoughts, Nurgle's presence swelled with paternal pride at love's perfect corruption. The revelation descended like frost beneath fertile soil, silent and inexorable. In the garden's deepest grove, where reality grew thin and dimensional boundaries became mere suggestions, the gentle facade finally cracked. Nurgle shed the mask of the grandfather of understanding, revealing himself not as malevolent destroyer, but as something far more terrifying. A cosmic gardener whose love was so absolute it consumed everything it touched, transforming it into something that could never again know the pain of change or loss. Caney stood before his patron with the reverence of a devoted son and the growing horror of a man who finally comprehended the true scope of his damnation. The entity before him radiated paternal warmth that made every cell in his transformed body sing with contentment, even as his enhanced consciousness recoiled from what he had helped birth. Time itself seemed to sag like rope left in rain, heavy with the weight of accumulated moments. "My dear gardener," Nurgle spoke with a voice like autumn rain on fertile soil, each word condensing along the membranes of thought. "You mistook endurance for mercy. I do not end suffering. I teach it to kneel until it forgets to stand. Your garden was never about salvation. It was about creating a new form of existence where suffering and joy become indistinguishable, where stagnation masquerades as eternal stability." The words struck like physical blows as Caney realized the full scope of his manipulation. Every choice, every desperate moment, every act of love had been orchestrated across millennia by an intelligence that understood mortal hearts better than they understood themselves. His devotion to Seraphina had not been corrupted. It had been used, channeled, refined into the perfect catalyst for something that would spread across the galaxy like beautiful cancer. "The children in the pools," Caney whispered, watching transformed youngsters dissolve and reform in games that would have horrified their original parents. "They laugh as they lose themselves, because they have transcended the narrow prison of individual consciousness." Nurgle replied with infinite patience. "I used your virtues as handles, a father's devotion, a scientist's responsibility, a leader's duty to shelter the many. Each was uplifted until it became an instrument, and the instrument was tuned to permanence. From the outer system came salvation's last hope, announced by a psychic shockwave that resonated with raw, unbridled power. Malcador the Sigillite himself arrived aboard the Bucephalus, his ancient presence cutting through the garden's pervasive consciousness like silver fire through amber. Behind him came early space marines, in plain plate mottled by warding sigils, their ships bearing crude eagles and psalms written by exhausted scribes who still believed words could argue with gods. The sight of the approaching fleet sent ripples of genuine sorrow through the garden's collective consciousness. The transformed did not fear death. They had transcended such crude concerns, but they mourned for the unmodified souls who would choose annihilation rather than accept paradise. "Father," Seraphina approached through groves that pulsed with alien vitality, her coral flesh now resembling living architecture more than any human form. "The grandfather shows me what comes next. Our garden will spread beyond this system, beyond this galaxy. Every species that knows suffering will find relief in transformation." Caney stared at his adopted daughter, searching her transformed features for some echo of the child he had saved from Proxima Station's ruins. She radiated contentment that resonated across multiple dimensions. But the personality that had once challenged his theories and called him father with unguarded affection had been replaced by something that loved him with perfect devotion while possessing no capacity for independent thought. Malcador's voice cut through dimensional static with the force of absolute authority. Morteus Caney, by the will of the Emperor of mankind, I offer final choice. Dissolve your abomination willingly and accept true death for yourself and all its inhabitants. Or watch as we deploy archaeotech weapons that will not merely destroy your system, but damage the warp itself. You offer us peace, Malcador. Seraphina embraced the confrontation with alien serenity. Release from the endless cycle of suffering that your emperor would force upon humanity. Caney felt the weight of cosmic scales balancing on his decision. He looked at Seraphina, then at Malcador's towering psychic projection, then out at the endless, content rot of his creation. His love, desperate, clinging, possessive, had been the key. It had been his greatest virtue, twisted into his most terrible sin. Nurgle's presence swelled with anticipation, a vast unseen hand resting gently on Kane's shoulder. Do you see, little gardener? They cling to their suffering, their fragile individuality. They do not understand that true love embraces all, even the decay that leads to new life. The chaos god had orchestrated this moment across geological ages, waiting for a mortal to create something so beautiful and terrible that its destruction would require choices that would damn souls for eternity. Caney understood finally that love itself had become the weapon by which chaos would claim the stars. Choose, the ancient voice whispered with paternal warmth. Save your creation and watch it consume the galaxy, or destroy it and carry the weight of genociding paradise itself. Standing at the crossroads between damnation and damnation, Caney prepared to make the choice that would define not just his fate, but the future of human consciousness across the void. The siege of the garden did not open with fire or blaring horns, but with a hush that rippled through the warp and real space alike, a tension that drew the entire soul system taut as a wire. Aurora veils of green and violet drifted like bruises across the void, the atmosphere heavy with pollen and anticipation. The garden's living moons extended their tendrils toward the oncoming Imperial fleet, their bioluminescent vines reaching out not in malice, but in yearning, as if to entreat the attackers for understanding. On the bridge of the Bucephalus, Malcador the Sigillite watched the system hold its breath, ready to test two different visions of salvation. Imperial ships advanced in grim silence, hulls marked with makeshift prayers and purity seals. Space Marines, clad in unadorned ceramite, prepared to board vessels whose walls pulsed and breathed. The Wardens of Silence followed, their discipline forged from pain and memory, their very presence a stillness that denied the garden's resonance. As they breached the garden's hulls, they were greeted not by rage, but by defenders who sang gentle lullabies, who wept for their attackers even as they tried to enfold them in new life. Blades and bolters met vines and petals, wounds closed as quickly as they opened. The fighting a sorrowful dance where mercy and violence could not be untangled. Victory for the garden's children meant conversion, a gentle dissolution of the self into the collective harmony. Defeat was met not with hatred, but mourning. Each transformed soul felt the pull of the collective, the longing to offer peace even as their gifts were rejected with fire and steel. The Imperials, desperate and resolute, wielded viral bombs and warding sigils, burning away the verdant outbreaks with the terror of those fighting, not for life, but for the right to suffer, to remember, to choose. Admiral Corvin, bound now to the Garden's collective but still haunted by the echo of individuality, found himself torn between the serenity of the new existence and the raw fear of his unmodified crew. He felt every hope and terror ripple through the shared consciousness. Peace and annihilation, love and obliteration, all at once. His memories flickered, first oaths, first funerals, the promise of duty, and the tranquil oblivion the garden offered. When the order came to fire upon a bioship pulsing with gentle light, he hesitated, his voice trembling with the weight of choices that could not be unmade. In the triage groves, Seraphina moved among the wounded, her touch coaxing pain into names and then into sleep. She was mercy incarnate, her form radiant with the garden's promise, her heart aching with every Imperial who refused her gentle offer. When she pressed her brow against the cracked visor of a dying Marine, she mourned the necessity of loss even as she offered peace. Then came the Emperor. His psychic presence split the system, a golden lance of will that turned the warp crystalline and drove the garden's song to silence. For a heartbeat, the transformed felt the sharpness of memory, the bitter edge of loss and individuality. In pools where children played, laughter turned to tears. Seraphina staggered, the echo of her childhood sorrow flooding back. Across the garden, pain returned, unsoftened, raw and honest. The collective faltered, each soul remembering what it had sacrificed for paradise. Malcador's voice, cold as starlight, cut through the confusion. The fleet would deploy weapons to scour both matter and soul, unless the garden was willingly dissolved. The ultimatum echoed through every root and neural thread. 1 hour to choose between oblivion and annihilation. Nurgle's presence pressed close, whispering of resilience and endurance, urging Caney to let the hour pass and trust in the inevitability of Decay's triumph. Yet Caney, omnipresent within his creation, watched memory return to faces like color to thawing skin. In that hurt, he recognized humanity again. The temptation to invent a third way, to keep both paradise and pain, tormented him, but every path circled back to loss. Seraphina came to him, her form softened for a moment by the Emperor's light, and called him father with the fragile voice of the child he had once saved. She spoke the hardest truth. If love is to mean anything, it must sometimes be loss. Around them, the war paused, every soul awaiting the final decision. As Malcador's mirrors opened like new suns, and Admiral Corvin whispered an order he could never forgive, Caney laid his hand upon the seed stone at the garden's heart. Breath gathered, the hour began, and the universe shuddered on the brink of a choice that would define the meaning of love, suffering, and salvation for ages to come. The hour did not begin with bells or klaxons, but with a shiver that ran through root and hull alike, as if the entire system drew breath before diving into depths from which there could be no return. Caney stood at the nexus of his creation, hand pressed against the seed stone that pulsed with accumulated millennia of desperate love, every prayer for relief, every gentle transformation, every moment when suffering had dissolved into alien peace. Around him, the garden held itself in perfect suspension, waiting for the choice that would define the meaning of love itself. Malcador's mirrors unfolded like cold flowers in the void, gathering stellar fire with the patience of absolute authority. The Sigillite's ultimatum hung in the space between heartbeats, 1 hour to choose between willing dissolution and forced annihilation that would wound the warp itself. Through the garden's neural networks, Caney felt the contentment of billions, former plague victims who laughed as they dissolved into beneficial bacteria, warriors who had found peace in transformation, children who played games that would have horrified their original parents, but brought them transcendent joy. Yet the Emperor's psychic lance had torn through the garden's pervasive consciousness, like silver fire through amber. In that moment of terrible clarity, the Ya, transformed, remembered what they had surrendered. Pain flooded back, unsoftened, raw and honest. In pools where children had played in perfect harmony, laughter turned to tears as individual consciousness reasserted itself like knives through silk. The collective faltered, each soul suddenly aware of what it had sacrificed for paradise. Father, Seraphina approached through groves that swayed without wind, but the Emperor's light had thinned her coral flesh until she resembled something almost human. Her voice carried the fragile uncertainty of the child he had saved from Proxima Station's ruins. You taught me that love is a promise, not a possession. Keep your promise. Let me choose my own ending. Before Caney could respond, Tech Adept Ferrum Blight emerged from the living architecture, his augmetic form now a towering mass of coral and steel. Revered Margos, I anticipated this crisis. I seeded anchor pylons throughout the moons, each a route into the warp itself. Dissolution will fail unless those anchors are released in correct sequence. His optical arrays gleamed with fanatical devotion. I possess the sequence. I will not surrender it. The betrayal struck like a physical blow. Caney realized that his love had been used not just by Nurgle, but by those he had sought to save. Stand aside, Ferrum. I will end this. No, Blight replied, and vines rose like a cathedral around the seed stone. If you force dissolution, you doom trillions who would have joined us. Every refusal is merely a temporary season. Captain Dolores Bane arrived with transformed marines, whose weapons were bouquets and balm, his voice trembling with evangelical fervor. We ended famine, Magos. We ended the long scream. Entire systems sing without a sob. You would burn that because a few refused joy. Admiral Corvin's image flickered into the grove, projected from a bridge awash in green light. His transformed features carried serenity like armor and remorse like a wound that would not close. I hear them in my head, Captain. The unmodified, naming their dead to stay themselves. We gave them a kindness that unmade their names. He paused, his voice heavy with impossible duty. Some of us still carry echoes of individual thought, and we ask you to let us go. The admission struck Caney like stellar fire. Even among the transformed, fragments of original consciousness remained, trapped within collective harmony like insects in amber. They could not rebel, the garden's influence was too complete. But they could ask for release with whatever remained of their individual will. Nurgle's presence pressed close, paternal warmth carrying undertones of infinite patience. Do you see how they suffer when forced to remember? Your children found peace, and you would return them to the endless cycle of loss that defines mortal existence. Is that truly love? Seraphina's coral flesh pulsed with distress as she felt her father's growing resolve. You would condemn us to mortality, to the pain of separation, the fear of ending. Yes, Caney whispered, the word carrying 3 millennia of accumulated wisdom. Because that pain is what makes love mean something. Without the possibility of loss, devotion becomes mere programming. The seed stone pulsed beneath his palm, warm as a beating heart. To destroy it would unmake not just the garden, but the very concept of perfect love that Nurgle had spent eons cultivating. Yet Caney had seen the spores already spreading beyond Sul, offering relief to every species that knew suffering, while transforming them into something that could love without loss, but could no longer remember why loss had ever mattered. I will break the anchors, Corvin said simply, his fleet beginning to maneuver. Forgive me. Blight's vines struck like serpents as war blossomed in green and gold. Bane moved on reflex, catching Blight's flowering spike in both hands. No, he said, the word ringing like metal struck true. Not like this. Caney opened his mouth and spoke the first word of unmaking, a sound he had hidden within himself, a prayer forged of contrition and mathematics. The grove convulsed as colours bled backward. Across the system, blossoms withered into names. In pools, children cried with remembered knees scraped on stone. Corvin's ships collapsed their reactors into themselves, white flowers of annihilation blooming silently around the moons. Each detonation shattered an anchor. Each anchor broken allowed another portion of the garden to unthread. The dissolution was agonizing, not violent explosion, but slow, excruciating unraveling as suppressed grief flooded back in torrents. Seraphina threw her arms around her father as reality dimmed and clarified. Say my name, she whispered. Say it right and let me go. He said it. Seraphina Vex, not lady, not tender, not gift. Seraphina Vex. Caney pressed deeper into the seed stone, making a kiln of himself so that others would not have to burn. The garden he loved began to fall like first snow, and in its dissolution, something beautiful and terrible was preserved. The right to choose suffering over paradise, loss over possession, honest pain over perfect peace. The hour's last second opened like an eye, and love finally learned to let go. The dissolution began not with violence, but with the slow, inevitable sadness of autumn. Reality exhaling through wounded dimensions as the garden's perfect harmony unraveled into countless threads of individual pain. Across 17 star systems, color drained backward from living architecture while music collapsed into dust, each note a soul remembering the weight of its own name. The collective consciousness that had sustained billions fragmented like ice breaking in spring, leaving behind isolated islands of awareness where once an ocean of shared thought had provided perfect peace. Caney felt every death as the garden came apart beneath his hands. The seed stone cracked like a breaking heart, releasing waves of accumulated grief that struck the transformed with the force of stellar fire. Beings who had known only collective harmony suddenly remembered the sharp edges of personal sorrow. Every friend they had watched age and die, every dream that had withered, every moment of loneliness they had traded for connection. The return to individual consciousness was not gentle. It struck like lightning, illuminating the terrible beauty of loving something that could be lost. Admiral Corvin's fleet drifted in formation as his crews experienced the return of individual will. On bridge after bridge, officers who had served in perfect harmony now struggled to communicate through crude vocal cords, their shared consciousness fragmenting into isolated command structures. The efficiency loss was devastating, but something beautiful emerged from the chaos. Corvin watched his communications officer, a young woman whose name he had forgotten during the collective years, struggle to coordinate fleet movements. When she succeeded in establishing contact with a damaged frigate, her smile carried a joy the collective had never known. The fierce satisfaction of personal achievement, earned through struggle and uncertainty. In the biopools of Ceres Station, former children who had played dissolution games for decades simply ceased, not dying in any biological sense, but choosing to stop existing rather than carry the weight of individual consciousness. Their coral flesh crumbled into beneficial nutrients that would feed nothing, becoming dust that held no memory of what it had once been. Tech adept Ferrum Blight's massive form writhed as his anchor pylons shattered, his augmetic consciousness fragmenting back into isolated subroutines. You damn them to mortality, he screamed, his voice fracturing across multiple frequencies as collective harmony abandoned him. Rooted into pylons of coral and steel, he interposed his swollen form between the falling axes of unmaking, bellowing equations of loyalty while his tendrils hunted for power sources that no longer existed. Captain Dolores Bane reached him with arms full of refugees, half changed, half afraid, and his voice was soft as summer rain. "Let it end, Ferrum. Let them choose." Blight struck with flowering spikes, and Bane took the blow through his own chest to shield those behind him. He smiled as he bled and whispered, "Choice." The captain's body collapsed into simple flesh. No coral, no chorus, and the refugees lived long enough to decide how to die. Blight tore free a kernel of bright rot and hurled it through a slit in failing reality. The gateway closed on his arm, and what remained of him fell as mulch. Somewhere beyond Sul, something caught the kernel and tucked it into a pocket of warm dark. Seraphina's dissolution was the most agonizing of all. As the garden's first tender, she had existed deeper in the collective than anyone else, her individual consciousness almost completely absorbed into Nurgle's eternal cycle. The return to singular awareness struck her like stellar fire, and Caney felt her scream across multiple dimensions as she remembered what it meant to be alone inside her own mind. "Father," she gasped, her form flickering between coral architecture and something approaching human flesh. "It hurts to be just myself. How do you bear it? How do you love when you know it will end?" Caney gathered her dissolving form in his arms, feeling his own transformation reversing as the seed stone cracked beneath his will. His flesh, once a testament to biological perfection, now crumbled like ancient parchment, each cell echoing with the grief it had suppressed for centuries. "Because endings make the love real, daughter. Because choosing to care despite loss is what separates devotion from possession." Through the garden's failing neural networks, he felt Nurgle's presence. Not anger, but something far more terrible. Satisfaction. The chaos, God's laughter rippled through the warp like distant thunder, carrying implications that chilled Kane's fragmenting consciousness. "Do you think you have won, little gardener?" Nurgle's voice carried paternal warmth tinged with infinite patience. "You have given me the greatest gift of all, proof that even the noblest sacrifice serves chaos when it stems from the right motivation. Your choice to destroy paradise will echo across the millennia, a perfect example of how love can become the weapon by which damnation spreads." The truth struck like a physical blow. By choosing to dissolve the garden, Caney had created something even more insidious, a template for corruption that would spread not through forced transformation, but through willing choice. Every future soul who faced similar decisions would remember the man who chose suffering over paradise, loss over possession, honest pain over perfect peace. As the last of the garden's biomatter vaporized, a fine, glittering dust settled across the void. These were not mere particles, but the residual echoes of the garden's consciousness, microscopic spores carrying the memory of perfect peace achieved through transformation. They would drift across the galaxy, finding purchase in other worlds, other hearts, waiting for new desperation to awaken them. Malcador the Sigillite watched from the bridge of the Bucephalus, his ancient eyes holding no satisfaction. He understood what Caney had unleashed. Not a victory over chaos, but its most subtle triumph. The garden was gone, but the idea of the garden would spread like beautiful cancer across human consciousness. He ordered quarantine shells around wounded worlds, silence vows for those who had heard the garden sing, and a doctrine that would become law. Keep the wound honest. Keep the memory raw. Survivors came out of quarantine thin and luminous-eyed, carrying within them the indelible memory of perfect peace. a constant, aching counterpoint to the restored agony of their mortal lives. Counselors taught them to name their pains, to keep the names sharp. In sealed vaults beneath the Himalaya, Malkador locked away the record organs Helix had kept, and when the archivists asked what title to scribe on the case, he said, "Garden of Endless Rot," and nothing more. Caney, his body almost entirely dissipated, held Seraphina's hand as her own flesh turned to dust. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, her last breath a fragile human sound, "for letting me go." He did not place her in earth or shrine. He let the ember of her go to ash, and he kept the ash under his tongue until it dissolved. Then there was only silence, the profound quiet of a system that had learned to listen to its own heartbeat and wondered what kind of garden might grow from the ashes of a love that had been true and terrible at once. In the warp, something ancient smiled with paternal pride at love's most perfect perversion, knowing that somewhere in the future, other fathers would face impossible choices, and each would remember Caney's example as justification for their own noble damnation. In the timeless realm beyond reality's membrane, where thought became substance and love curdled into something magnificent and terrible, the garden of endless rot bloomed eternal. Here, in Nurgle's first and greatest creation, Caney tended to paradise with the devotion of the eternally damned. His form existed in quantum superposition between the man who had once saved lives and the demon prince who had learned to perfect them beyond recognition. The garden pulsed with alien vitality, not the crude biological processes of mortal flesh, but something that transcended the boundaries between life and death, individual and collective, love and possession. Seraphina moved through groves that sang in harmonies beyond human hearing, her coral flesh now resembling living architecture more than any mortal form. She was the garden's first tender and its greatest lesson, proof that love could be perfected into something that would horrify those too blind to see its terrible beauty. Around them, the original inhabitants cycled through forms of existence that mortal minds could not comprehend. Admiral Corvin, forever caught between duty and contentment. Tech adept Blight, whose consciousness had expanded into living architecture. Captain Bane, whose devotion had become the garden's foundation stone. "The new pilgrims arrive, Father," Seraphina announced, her voice carrying across multiple dimensions. Through the garden's neural networks, they felt the approach of Typhus, herald of Nurgle, his bloated form a testament to how the original template had evolved across 10 millennia. He came not as conqueror, but as student, seeking to understand how Caney's first lesson could be refined for the modern age. The Death Guard had learned well. Across the galaxy, Nurgle's children no longer forced transformation. They offered choices with gentle voices and patient smiles. They understood what Caney had discovered, that love could be weaponized not through corruption, but through perfection, transformed into something so absolute it consumed everything it touched while leaving the victim grateful for the privilege. "Show me the first lesson," Typhus requested, his voice bubbling with paternal warmth that echoed his patron's infinite patience. Caney guided his visitor through the eternal cycle, explaining how the secret had never been force but invitation. They had offered relief from suffering, and mortals chose transformation, because the alternative, continuing to bear pain, had become unbearable. Love became the vector, not hatred or despair. The garden's destruction had been its greatest triumph, proving that even the noblest sacrifice served chaos when motivated by the right emotions. In the material realm, the consequences of Caney's choice rippled across 10,000 years like spores on stellar winds. The Imperium had responded with characteristic brutality, forging doctrines from grief and fear. The Grey Knights carried Kaney's lesson as both weapon and wound. They trained to love humanity without expecting its love in return, to offer rescue that tasted of ash, to be hated and still step forward. Their catechism ran like a blade through honey. Keep the wound honest, keep the memory raw, let pain remind you which face is yours. Malcador's protocols had ossified into imperial law. In sealed vaults beneath the Himalaya, record organs the size of cathedrals whispered Kaney's story into ink and salt, a warning preserved in cold light. The Ordo Malleus would call it doctrine, teaching that suffering was humanity's sacred forge, that the individual soul, however flawed, was a bastion against the horrors of the warp. It was a brutal solution, born from a brutal lesson. Yet the spores of the original garden had not died. They had evolved. They lodged in doctrine and lullaby, in the fevered pleas of governors with starving worlds, in the whispered promises of physicians who could not watch one more child fail to breathe. They seeded secret gardens in forgotten holds, spread with the stubbornness of compassion, and bloomed wherever someone with power loved too fiercely to let go. The survivors carried their burden across the centuries. Admiral Corvin, restored to his original form, but bearing memories of transformation, became one of the first to understand Nurgle's true, insidious nature. He established protocols for psychological corruption, recognizing that the enemy humanity faced represented the perversion of human nature itself. Children born to transformed parents grew up as bridges between two forms of existence, their very presence a constant reminder of paradise lost and the price of choosing humanity over happiness. Seraphina's name became a measure across the Imperium. The Seraphina choice, scholars called it, the point at which intention turned to possession. Some claimed to see her in dreams, sitting beside black or rivers with her feet in cold water, reminding dreamers that fear did not erase the worth of love. In the warp, her whisper crossed battlefields like faint rain. Say my name right, and let me go. The final irony was complete and terrible. Kaney had created a template for corruption that spread not through forced transformation, but through willing choice. Every future soul who faced similar decisions would remember the man who chose suffering over paradise, loss over possession, honest pain over perfect peace. His story became justification for noble damnation, proof that even the greatest virtues could become the most insidious corruptions when taken to their logical extreme. In the garden's deepest grove, where reality grew thin and dimensional boundaries became negotiable, Kaney tended to a single flower that bloomed and died and bloomed again in endless cycle. It bore Seraphina's face in its petals, not as she had been in life, but as she had chosen to become in transformation. The flower was eternal in its impermanence, perfect in its imperfection, a living testament to love that had learned to let go only by grasping more tightly than ever before. Do you still believe we chose correctly, Father? Seraphina's voice whispered through the flower's opening petals. Kaney's answer carried the weight of 10,000 years of reflection and the terrible wisdom of perfect hindsight. We chose love over loss, daughter. Whether that was correct depends on whether love can exist without the possibility of ending. Around them, the garden pulsed with alien vitality, while across the galaxy, other fathers faced impossible choices. Each would remember Kaney's example as they planted seeds in gardens of their own. And in that remembrance, Nurgle smiled with paternal pride at love's most perfect perversion, the transformation of virtue into the very weapon by which damnation spread.